Hello, students. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the effects of colonization on the Americas. As we've discussed in previous lessons, Europe was affected by colonization as well. There were American crops that were brought back to Europe for the first time, such as beans and pumpkins and potatoes, and there were also some American diseases that were brought back to Europe as well. But the Americas were fundamentally changed by colonization in a way that Europe was not. So for the next few minutes, let's focus on that. And let's begin with the people that were most affected by the arrival of Europeans, the Native Americans. We've talked about the effects of European diseases quite a bit, so I won't go into just a whole lot of detail. But as we've discussed earlier, Europeans brought diseases such as smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, that the natives were not immune to. And they died from these diseases in great numbers. It's estimated that somewhere between 80 and 90% of all Native Americans in both North and South America died from European diseases. Something we really haven't talked about at this point is the dependence that the Native Americans developed on European goods. The Europeans brought over quite a few items that the natives were not able to produce on their own. For example, guns, steel, any kind of metal. The Native Americans had not learned these trades yet. And so over time, the Native Americans slowly start to obtain these goods, sometimes through theft. If the Native Americans were to defeat a group of Europeans, they would probably take their guns, take their tools, their pots and pans, but usually they obtained these goods through trade. Take, for example, the French. The French established settlements in Canada along the St. Lawrence River, and they were heavily involved in the fur trade. They wanted the natives to bring them furs that they could then sell back to Europe. Well, what do you pay for these furs with? European goods. Give the natives guns, give them metal tools, pots and pans. And the problem is, while the natives learn how to use these things, they never learn how to make them on their own. And so they are slowly becoming too dependent on the Europeans. They depend on the Europeans to obtain guns, to obtain metal tools, and so on and so forth. European religions also have a major impact on Native American lifestyles. As we've discussed earlier, the Spanish attempted to convert the Native Americans to Christianity, and so did the French. Now, these two countries, while they had the end goal, the same end goal in mind, to convert these natives to Christianity, they went about it in two very different ways. The Spanish priests who were working to convert the Native Americans were primarily Franciscan priests, while the French priests were primarily Jesuits. They're both Catholic. They just go about their trade in very different ways. Now, as I told my students, there is a phrase that essentially sums up how the Spanish, the French, and the English all viewed and treated the Native Americans. Lead me, follow me, or get out of my way. So as far as the Spanish go, the Spanish would establish missions, which was essentially a community that included a church. It was run by Spanish Franciscan priests. And the goal was to get the Native Americans to move to these missions and not only become Christians, but also to learn Spanish, to learn a European trade, such as blacksmithing or carpentry, to learn how to farm like a European. So, in other words, the mission of the missions was to turn the natives into Spaniards. So, as far as the Spanish go, you could sum up their relationship with the natives with the phrase, "Follow me." They want the natives to come to them. On the other hand, the French priests, who were Jesuits, they were called black robes by the Native Americans for obvious reasons when you look at this painting. You could sum up their relationship with the natives with the phrase, "Lead me." Instead of establishing missions, they would often move into native settlements. They would learn the native languages. And sometimes they would even form military alliances with the natives. Like they would agree to fight alongside them against a rival tribe. So this tended to be a bit more effective, at least when it came to establishing friendly relationships with the natives. The natives did tend to like the French a lot more than they liked the Spanish. So, "lead me" represents the French. "Follow me" represents the Spanish. So, what about the English? They are represented by the phrase, "get out of my way." The English really weren't all that interested in converting the Native Americans to Christianity. They simply wanted land so they could grow tobacco and indigo and sugarcane, rice. So they simply wanted the Native Americans out of their way. So this leads to a series of Native American conflicts between English settlers and the native population. One of the first wars to break out between the English and the Indians occurred in Virginia. This is known as the Anglo-Powhatan War, or wars. There were actually 3 of them between 1609 and the 1640s. And this war really sets a pattern for other Indian wars that will follow. The English settlers steadily moved further and further into Indian territory. The Indians got very fed up with this, and they would strike back. They would try to drive the English out of their territory. And they had some early success. They caught the English by surprise, and they actually killed, it's estimated, around 1 out of every 4 English settlers in the colony of Virginia. But the English were able to regroup, and because they had superior technology in the form of guns, they were able to reestablish their claim on the land and essentially wiped out the Powhatan Indians. And this is something you will see time and time and time again throughout American history. From this time period all the way up to the end of the 1800s. There's another conflict that takes place in New England. This is referred to as King Philip's War. Now, the war gets its name from Chief Metacom, who the English referred to as King Philip. And you essentially see the same thing in King Philip's War as you do with the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. The English are pushing further and further into Indian territory. The Indians become very upset about this, and they fight back to protect their land. The English, although they are caught by surprise at first, fight back, and because they have superior technology, they eventually wipe out the Indians. And this war essentially wipes out most of the Native American groups that are in New England. So other than devastating the native population. These wars lead to a change in attitude between the English settlers and the Native Americans. What you see on the left here is a painting of the quote-unquote first Thanksgiving between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans that met them when they landed at Plymouth. The English probably never viewed the Native Americans as their equals, but they could at least view them as military allies. This really changes after the Powhatan Wars and after King Philip's War. Instead, the English think of the natives in these terms, as uncivilized savages who kill women and children. They're seen as a threat, and this is really how many later English settlers, and after them Americans, will view the Native Americans.